Blake Canada stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 47th floor, his Patek Philippe watch marking 6:47 p.m. as another Manhattan day faded into dusk. The golden light of sunset painted the glass towers in warm hues, but the warmth didn't penetrate the climate-controlled environment of his office. His reflection showed a man in his early 40s, wearing a Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, with streaks of gray at his temples that spoke of experience rather than age. The divorce papers lay unsigned on his desk, another reminder of how his relentless pursuit of success had cost him his 3-year marriage to Catherine. "You're married to your hotels," she'd said during their last conversation. He couldn't argue with that. Another record quarter, Mr. Canada, his assistant Sarah had announced earlier, placing the latest financial reports on his desk. Sarah had been with him for 8 years, probably knew him better than Catherine ever did. "The board is thrilled. They're talking about expanding into the Asian market." He should have felt triumphant. Instead, the words echoed hollowly in his chest, much like the congratulatory dinner he'd attended last night at Le Bernardin. Expensive, perfectly executed, and utterly devoid of meaning. 20 years of climbing the corporate ladder, and now that he'd reached the summit as CEO of Platinum Hospitality Group, all he felt was an overwhelming emptiness. Blake loosened his Hermes tie and sank into his ergonomic leather chair. His eyes fell on a framed photo of his parents' old bed and breakfast in Vermont, the Maple Haven. They'd sold it 5 years ago when they retired to Florida, but he remembered the warmth of that place. He remembered helping his mother bake fresh scones every morning, watching his father teach guests how to tap maple trees, and the genuine connections his parents formed with everyone who stayed there. His phone buzzed, another message from the board about quarterly projections. Blake ignored it, instead pulling up the file on Cascade Falls Resort. The property in upstate New York had been a recent acquisition, part of a package deal, with 3 other boutique hotels. While the other properties had smoothly transitioned into the Platinum Hospitality model, Cascade Falls remained an anomaly. The numbers shouldn't work. Their revenue per available room was 22% below company standards. Their operating costs were higher than acceptable, and they hadn't implemented any of Platinum's efficiency protocols. Yet their guest satisfaction scores were the highest in the entire portfolio, with an unprecedented 87% return rate. Something didn't add up, and for the first time in years, Blake felt genuinely curious. He began digging deeper into the property's files, past the financial reports and into guest comments, staff records, and operational procedures. 3 hours later, he had an idea that would either save his soul or destroy his career, possibly both. Benjamin Nevada was born that night, created with the help of Sarah, who looked at him like he'd lost his mind but helped anyway. A mid-level hospitality consultant with a solid but unremarkable resume, Benjamin would arrive at Cascade Falls for a month-long evaluation, giving Blake the opportunity to understand what made this place so special. "Have you considered that this might have something to do with Catherine?" Sarah asked as she helped craft Benjamin's background story. Blake paused in the middle of selecting appropriately unremarkable business-casual attire online. "What do you mean?" "This whole identity crisis. The divorce papers are still unsigned. You haven't taken a vacation in 6 years, and suddenly you want to play undercover boss at some small resort in the mountains." "This isn't about Catherine," Blake insisted, though Sarah's words hit uncomfortably close to home. "This is about understanding why this property defies every metric we've established, every principle I've built this company on." Sarah raised an eyebrow but continued helping him prepare. Over the next week, Blake grew out his usual clean-shaven, look into a neat beard, ordered a wardrobe from J. Crew and Banana Republic, and practiced introducing himself as Benjamin Nevada until it felt natural. The final touch was trading his Mercedes S-Class for a rented Toyota Camry. As he packed the sensible sedan with his new identity, Sarah handed him a burner phone and a final piece of advice. "Try to remember who you were before you became Blake Canada, CEO." The drive through the Adirondacks felt like traveling back in time. Gone were the steel and glass towers of Manhattan, replaced by ancient maples and oaks wearing their autumn colors like royal robes. Benjamin's Toyota Camry handled the winding mountain roads competently, if without the precision he was used to in his Mercedes. His GPS announced his arrival at Cascade Falls Resort, just as the Victorian-era main building came into view. The structure rose from a clearing like something from a postcard, its architecture grand yet welcoming, with wraparound porches and gables that spoke of a bygone era. The morning sun caught the dew on the perfectly maintained lawn, creating a shimmer that made the scene almost ethereal. As he pulled into the parking lot, Benjamin noticed the details his corporate reports had missed. The flower beds were bursting with late-season blooms, arranged not in the uniform patterns his company preferred, but in natural-looking clusters that somehow worked better. The paths were laid with local stone rather than standard pavers, and the rocking chairs on the porch were clearly antiques, not the mass-produced replicas his purchasing department would have ordered. A woman emerged from the main entrance, and Benjamin felt his carefully constructed persona falter slightly. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, wearing a simple blue blazer over dark jeans, with auburn hair caught in the morning breeze, and a natural grace to her movements. She walked directly toward him, and he noticed her smile reached her eyes, something he'd learned to spot after years of corporate presentations. "You must be Benjamin Nevada," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Emma Texas, the general manager. Welcome to Cascade Falls." Her handshake was firm, her green eyes direct and friendly. Something about her presence made Benjamin momentarily forget his rehearsed introduction. He caught a hint of vanilla and lavender. Not perfume, he realized, but probably from the kitchen and garden she'd walked through. "Thank you," he managed, recovering quickly. "I'm looking forward to learning about your operation here." The words felt stiff, too corporate, and he saw a flicker of something, concern, disappointment, cross Emma's face. "Let's start with breakfast," she suggested, checking her watch. "Our chef makes the best blueberry pancakes in the Adirondacks, and you can tell me what brings a hospitality consultant to our little corner of the world." As they walked inside, Benjamin found himself studying Emma as she greeted staff and guests alike. There was an authenticity to her interactions that seemed foreign to the hospitality industry he knew. She remembered names, asked about family members, and showed genuine interest in the responses. The main lobby was a study in controlled chaos. A family was checking in, their 2 young children excitedly talking about the hiking trails. An elderly couple sat in leather armchairs by the stone fireplace, reading newspapers and sharing what smelled like fresh-baked scones. A staff member was arranging fresh flowers while chatting with guests about local attractions. "Mrs. Peterson, your usual table is ready," Emma called to the elderly woman by the fire. "Chef remembered you prefer your coffee with just a splash of cream." Benjamin followed Emma into the dining room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the lake. The tables were set with mismatched vintage china that somehow created a cohesive look. The room buzzed with conversation and the clink of cutlery, feeling more like a family gathering than a hotel restaurant. "Tell me about your background." "Or Benjamin," Emma said as they settled at a corner table. "What made you choose hospitality consulting?" The question hit closer to home than she could know. Benjamin took a sip of perfectly brewed coffee, served in a hand-thrown ceramic mug, and shared a version of the truth. "My parents ran a small B&B in Vermont," he said, thinking of the Maple Haven. "I grew up in the industry, learned it from the ground up. But somewhere along the way, I got caught up in the corporate side of things. Spreadsheets, efficiency metrics, standardization." Emma nodded, studying him with those penetrating green eyes. "And now? I'm trying to understand if there's a better way. Your resort's numbers are unusual, but your guest satisfaction scores are extraordinary. I want to understand why." "Numbers don't tell the whole story," Emma said. Just as a plate of blueberry pancakes appeared before them. "You try these, and then I'll show you what makes Cascade Falls special." Benjamin's first week at Cascade Falls was a masterclass in everything his corporate playbook got wrong. While Platinum Hospitality Group focused on standardization and efficiency, Cascade Falls operated on principles that seemed almost anarchic on the surface, but revealed their wisdom through results. "The key is knowing your guests," Emma explained as they walked the grounds early one morning. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke from the fireplace. "Not just their preferences in our database, but who they are as people." She demonstrated this throughout the day. Benjamin watched as she stopped to chat with a retired professor who visited every fall to work on his novel. "Professor Jenkins prefers the desk by the east window," she told Benjamin later. The morning light helps his arthritis, and he says the view of the mountains inspires his writing. In the kitchen, Chef Marcus, a burly man with tattoos visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves, showed Benjamin how they accommodated guests, dietary restrictions, and personal preferences. Mrs. Rodriguez is allergic to shellfish but loves seafood, he explained, preparing a special cod dish. So we created this recipe just for her. Now she brings her whole family twice a year. The resort's approach to maintenance was equally personal. Tom, the head of maintenance, knew every creak in every floorboard, every quirk of the century-old plumbing system. Sure, replacing everything would be more efficient, he admitted, while showing Benjamin the boiler room. But there's character in these old bones. Just needs understanding and care, like people do. Benjamin took careful notes, ostensibly for his consultant report, but really trying to understand how this place operated so differently from his corporate properties. The staff didn't work in rigid departments but flowed between roles as needed. The gardener helped with luggage during busy check-in times. The front desk clerk assisted in the dining room during dinner rush. How do you maintain quality with such a fluid structure? He asked Emma as they reviewed the day's operations in her office. The space reflected her management style, organized but personal, with guest thank-you notes pinned alongside scheduling sheets. We hire for heart first, skills second, she replied, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. Anyone can learn procedures, but you can't teach someone to care. The statement hit Benjamin hard, reminding him of his own corporate hiring practices, all credentials and experience, measured against standardized metrics. He thought of the soul-crushing training videos and thick manuals of procedures that every platinum property required. As the week progressed, Benjamin found himself drawn into the resort's rhythm. He helped the kitchen staff prep vegetables when they were short-handed, spent an afternoon with Rosa in the gardens learning about her organic growing methods, and even filled in at the front desk during a particularly busy afternoon. Each interaction taught him something his MBA hadn't. He learned that Mrs. Henderson's coffee on the east porch wasn't just about coffee. It was her time to remember her late husband, who had loved watching the sunrise from that spot. The Patels in room 212 weren't just celebrating an anniversary. They were recreating their first vacation after beating cancer. These weren't data points in a customer relationship management system. They were stories, connections, moments of genuine human interaction that his corporate properties had systematically eliminated in the name of efficiency. By his second week at Cascade Falls, Benjamin had fallen into a comfortable routine that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. Each morning began with a walk around the property with Emma, discussing the day ahead while watching the sun rise over the lake. These walks were becoming the highlight of his days, though he tried not to examine that fact too closely. Emma had a way of making him forget he was Blake Canada, CEO, making him feel more like the young man who had once dreamed of running his parents' B&B. What made you choose this place? He asked one morning as they paused by the boathouse. The lake was mirror smooth, reflecting the autumn colors like a painter's palette. Emma was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water. I was supposed to be a lawyer, she finally said. Had the degree, the job offer at a prestigious firm in Boston. Then my grandmother got sick, and I came to help run this place, temporarily. That was 8 years ago. She turned to face him, and Benjamin was struck by how the morning light caught the gold flecks in her green eyes. I discovered that making someone's vacation special, giving them memories they'll treasure forever, that meant more to me than any corporate law career could. The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. How many small, personal hotels had he acquired and transformed into efficient, soulless operations? How many Emmas had he replaced with corporate managers? Their morning walks often extended into long conversations about the hospitality industry, during which Benjamin had to carefully guard his words to avoid revealing his true expertise. But increasingly, their discussions turned personal. You never finished telling me about your parents' B&B, Emma said one afternoon as they helped Rosa plant bulbs for spring. Benjamin's expensive manicure was ruined by dirt, but he found he didn't care. The Maple Haven, he said, the name bringing back a rush of memories. It was small, just 12 rooms, but every guest felt like family. My mother used To say that hospitality was just friendship with better sheets. Emma laughed, the sound carrying across the gardens. She sounds wise. Do they still run it? No, Benjamin replied, feeling the familiar pang of regret. They sold it 5 years ago. The area was changing. Bigger hotels moving in. They said it was time to retire, but... He trailed off, remembering how defeated his father had looked signing the sale papers. But what? But I think... They really sold because they knew the industry was changing. Everything was becoming about efficiency and scale. Personal touch was becoming obsolete. He realized he was quoting himself from a shareholders' meeting and fell silent. Emma studied him for a moment, dirt smudged on her cheek, looking more beautiful than any of the polished executives he usually dealt with. Personal touch isn't obsolete, Benjamin. It's just harder to quantify on a spreadsheet. That's why consultants like you often miss it. The guilt of his deception weighed heavily, but before he could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of the Patels. Returning from their morning hike, Emma immediately switched her attention to them, asking about their adventure and recommending a local massage therapist for Mr. Patel's sore muscles. Benjamin watched her interact with the couple, noting how she remembered details about their children, their favorite wines, their previous visits. It was the kind of attention to detail he'd once prided himself on, before spreadsheets and stockholder meetings had taken over his life. That evening, as he sat in his room updating his notes, Benjamin realized he was documenting more than just business observations. He was recording the way Emma's eyes crinkled when she laughed, how she hummed old jazz standards while reviewing paperwork, how she knew exactly when someone needed a kind word or a moment of quiet understanding. His phone buzzed, Sarah checking in from New York. "The board's asking questions," her text read. "How long do you need?" Benjamin looked out his window at the moonlit lake, thinking of Emma's words about personal touch and spreadsheets. "Not sure yet," he replied. "There's more to learn here." The idea for the holiday festival came during a rainy morning meeting in the resort's library. Emma had gathered the staff to discuss the upcoming winter season, traditionally their slowest period. Benjamin sat in a worn leather armchair, watching her energize the team in a way his corporate motivational speakers never could. "We need to show people that Cascade Falls isn't just a summer and fall destination," Emma said, pacing in front of the fireplace. Rain drummed against the windows, creating a cozy atmosphere that made the room feel like a family gathering, rather than a business meeting. "We need to create something magical." Benjamin observed the staff's reactions. Unlike his corporate meetings where employees nodded mechanically, here they leaned forward, engaged. Chef Marcus was already scribbling menu ideas. Rosa was whispering with Tom about winter garden installations. "What if we created a holiday festival?" Emma continued, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Not just decorations and a fancy dinner, but a real celebration of what makes this place special. Local artisans, cooking workshops, sleigh rides, through the property." "We could set up an ice skating rink on the lake," Tom suggested. "I know a guy who maintains the town rink. He could teach us." "And winter foraging classes," Rosa added. "The winter mushrooms here are amazing, and guests always ask about them." Benjamin found himself drawn into the planning, despite his intentions to maintain professional distance. "You could partner with local farms," he suggested. "Create a farm-to-table winter menu, maybe even offer sleigh rides to see the maple tapping process." Emma's eyes met his, and the warmth in her smile made him momentarily forget his role. "That's brilliant, Benjamin. Would you help us? Coordinate with local businesses. You seem to have a knack for this." Over the next few weeks, Benjamin threw himself into festival planning, drawing on his years of event experience while carefully hiding the full extent of his expertise. The project gave him legitimate reasons to spend more time with Emma, though he told himself it was purely professional interest that made his heart race when she walked into a room. Late nights reviewing plans over coffee in the empty dining room became a routine. Emma's passion for the project was infectious, her attention to detail matching his own perfectionist tendencies. She wanted every aspect of the festival to reflect Cascade Falls' personal touch. "These corporate resorts do everything with such polish," she said one evening as they worked on the budget. "But it's all surface. No soul. I want our guests to feel like they're coming home for the holidays. Benjamin thought of the elaborate Christmas galas at his platinum properties, identical events replicated across all locations, down to the same champagne brand and identical table settings. Sometimes polish isn't everything, he said softly. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same document, and neither pulled away immediately. The contact sent electricity through Benjamin's arm, and when he looked up, Emma's eyes held questions he wasn't ready to answer. The moment was broken by her phone chiming. Emma's face fell as she read the message, color draining from her cheeks. "What's wrong?" Benjamin asked, fighting the urge to reach for her hand again. "Corporate's sending someone next week," she said, her voice tight. "There are rumors about a complete buyout and restructuring." She looked up at him, vulnerability clear in her eyes. "Everything we've built here could change." Benjamin felt the weight of his deception like a physical blow. He knew exactly what was coming. He'd signed off on the preliminary paperwork himself weeks ago, before his arrival at Cascade Falls. The standard platinum hospitality transformation, streamlined operations, standardized procedures, efficiency, metrics that would destroy everything that made this place special. The next few days at Cascade Falls felt like watching a storm approach. Staff whispered in corners, their usual easy camaraderie strained by uncertainty. Even the guests seemed to sense the tension, though Emma worked tirelessly to maintain the resort's warm atmosphere. Benjamin watched her handle everything with grace, all while unknowingly confiding her fears to the very person responsible for them. Each conversation felt like a betrayal, especially as he found himself falling deeper into the role of confidant and friend. "These corporate types don't understand what we do here," Emma said one evening as they walked the property after closing. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the fireplace. "They'll see our numbers and think we're underperforming, but they won't see how Mrs. Henderson lights up when we remember her birthday, or how the Patels come back every year because this is where they fell in love." Benjamin stopped at the lakeside, watching the moonlight ripple on the water. "Maybe they'll understand if you show them," he suggested, knowing he was really talking to himself. "Not everyone in the corporate world is soulless." Emma turned to face him, her expression serious. "Do you really believe that?" "Because I've seen what happens when these big companies take over. They strip away everything unique. Everything personal until it's just another luxury hotel that could be anywhere in the world." The truth of her words stung. How many times had he praised the consistency of guest experience across his properties? How many local managers had he replaced with corporate-trained professionals who knew the manual but not the soul of their hotels? Their conversation was interrupted by Tom, the maintenance manager, hurrying down the path. "Emma, you need to see this," he said, holding up his tablet. "The company that's looking to buy us, it's Platinum Hospitality Group." Benjamin felt his heart stop as Emma took the tablet, her hands shaking slightly. "Platinum? But they're known for—" She trailed off, reading the article. "Their CEO, Blake Canada. He's supposed to be brilliant but ruthless. They say he can double a property's profit margin in 6 months. By turning them into cookie-cutter luxury hotels," Tom added bitterly. "My cousin worked at one of their properties in Florida. Said it was like working in a beautiful prison. Everything perfect, but no heart." Benjamin stood silently, feeling the weight of his two identities crushing him. He watched Emma's face as she read about his corporate self, saw the worry, lines form around her eyes, and realized he'd never felt more ashamed of his success. "The corporate representative arrives tomorrow," Emma said finally, handing the tablet back to Tom. "We need to be ready. This place, it's more than just a hotel. It's a home for our guests, for our staff. We have to make them understand that." After Tom left, Emma turned to Benjamin, vulnerability clear in her expression. "I know you've only been here a few weeks, but you understand what makes this place special, don't you? You'll help us show them." Benjamin nodded, unable to trust his voice. As they walked back to the main building, Emma leaned against him slightly, seeking comfort. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his heart pounding with equal parts love and dread. Tomorrow, Sarah would arrive to check on his progress. Soon, he'd have to make a decision that would affect not only the resort, but also this connection. He'd found with Emma, a connection built on a foundation of lies. The morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight sparkling off frost-covered grass as Blake, stood in his room, methodically transforming back into his CEO persona. The Tom Ford suit felt like armor, the Patek Philippe watch, a shackle. His reflection showed the polished executive he'd spent 20 years becoming, but now the image felt like a stranger. He thought of the moment ahead, of Emma's inevitable reaction. His stomach churned. The past weeks had shown him everything his corporate empire lacked. Genuine warmth, personal connections, the kind of hospitality that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. A knock at his door made him flinch. "Mr. Canada?" Sarah's voice was professional but held a note of sympathy. "The staff is gathering for the morning meeting." Blake opened the door to find his assistant impeccably dressed in corporate attire. "How bad is it in New York?" he asked, adjusting his tie. "The board is getting restless. They're expecting your final decision on the Cascade Falls acquisition by week's end." Sarah hesitated. "Blake, are you sure about this? I've never seen you like this over a property before." "It's not just about the property," he admitted, thinking of Emma's smile, her passion for hospitality, the way she'd helped him remember who he used to be. He found Emma in her office, reviewing documents for the corporate meeting. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the auburn highlights in her hair. She looked up with a smile that froze when she saw his attire. "Benjamin, why are you dressed like—" Her eyes moved from his suit to Sarah standing in the doorway. Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. "Mr. Canada!" The color drained from her face. "Blake Canada?" "Emma, please let me explain," Blake started, taking a step forward. She held up her hand, stopping him. The hurt in her eyes was worse than any angry outburst. "All this time, you were here to evaluate us for acquisition. Was anything real?" "Everything I felt was real," Blake insisted, his carefully prepared speech forgotten. "I came here with one perspective, but you showed me what truly matters in this business, what my parents understood that I'd forgotten." Emma stood, her professional mask sliding into place, though he could see her hands trembling. "If you'll excuse me, I need some air." She walked out, leaving Blake standing in her office, the weight of his deception crushing him. "That could have gone better," Sarah observed quietly. Blake sank into Emma's chair, surrounded by evidence of her dedication to Cascade Falls. Guest letters, staff schedules annotated with personal notes, photos of celebrations and quiet moments. "I've spent years believing efficiency and standardization were the keys to success," he said. "What if I've been destroying everything that matters?" For 3 days, Emma avoided him. Blake stayed at the resort, working from her office, completely dismantling and rebuilding his plans for Cascade Falls. Sarah helped, though she clearly thought he'd lost his mind. "The board won't like this," she warned, reviewing his new proposal. "It goes against everything Platinum stands for." "Maybe it's time for Platinum to stand for something else," Blake replied, thinking of his parents, B&B, of Emma's vision for hospitality. He found Emma at sunrise by the lake, her breath visible in the cold air. She didn't acknowledge his approach, but she didn't walk away either. Progress, of sorts. "I've spent years chasing profits," he said, standing beside her. "I've acquired properties, standardized operations, maximized efficiency. By every corporate metric, I've been incredibly successful." He paused, watching a pair of ducks glide across the misty water. "But success feels hollow when you've lost your soul." Emma kept her eyes on the water. "How can I trust anything?" "You say, because I'm not asking you to trust Blake Canada, CEO. I'm asking you to trust the man who fell in love with this place, and with you, the man who finally remembered who he wanted to be." He handed her a folder containing his new proposal. Cascade Falls would become the model for a new division of the company, focusing on personalized, boutique experiences. Emma would have full autonomy, with resources to expand her vision. "I don't want to change what makes this place special," he said. "I want to protect it, to learn from it, to help other properties rediscover what hospitality really means. Emma finally looked at him, her expression guarded but thoughtful. And the board? Your shareholders? Let me worry about them. I've spent 20 years convincing people to follow my vision. It's time that vision included something more than profit margins. She opened the folder, reading carefully. Blake watched her face, seeing the moment professional interest overcame personal hurt. This organizational structure, she said, pointing to a diagram. It preserves our current staff relationships while adding support resources. Your team works because they're free to respond to guests' needs naturally, Blake explained. The corporate structure should support that, not restrict it. They spent the next hour by the lake, discussing the proposal. Emma's anger gradually gave way to cautious engagement, then genuine enthusiasm as she saw the possibilities. Her suggestions improved the plan, adding practical details that his corporate perspective had missed. Why did you really come here? She asked finally, as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Blake considered the question carefully. I told myself it was about understanding why your metrics defied corporate logic. But really, I think I was looking for something I'd lost. Something I remembered from my parents' B&B but forgot in the corner office. And did you find it? He looked at her, seeing the strength and warmth that had drawn him from the beginning. I found more than I was looking for. The question is, can you forgive the lie that brought me here? The next month at Cascade Falls was a whirlwind of activity. Blake split his time between the resort and New York, fighting for his new vision with the same tenacity he'd once applied to corporate acquisitions. Emma, still cautious but increasingly invested, worked tirelessly to implement changes that enhanced rather than altered the resort's character. The board thinks I've lost my mind, Blake admitted one evening, loosening his tie as he joined Emma on the porch. The autumn chill had given way to the first hints of winter, and the air smelled of wood smoke and pine. Have you? Emma asked, handing him a mug of hot cider. Her tone was light, but he could hear the underlying concern. Blake took a sip, savoring the blend of sweet and spice. Maybe, but I haven't felt this alive in years. The holiday festival became their proving ground. Emma's personal touches combined with Blake's business acumen to create something truly magical. Local artisans set up booths selling handcrafted goods. Chef Marcus led cooking workshops featuring traditional Adirondack winter recipes. Tom and his team transformed the lakefront into a picturesque ice skating rink. As the festival approached, guests from Blake's corporate hotels started arriving, drawn by the promise of an authentic winter experience. Blake watched with pride as Emma and her team worked their magic, turning strangers into friends, creating the kind of memories no standard luxury hotel could match. Mr. Canada? A hesitant voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Mrs. Henderson, the elderly regular guest, looking up at him with a mixture of concern and hope. Yes, Mrs. Henderson. Is everything all right? She patted his arm gently. I just wanted to say, whatever you're doing here, please don't stop. This place has been my second home for 15 years. I was so worried when I heard about the corporate takeover. But now, she gestured to the festive scene around them. It feels more like home than ever. Blake felt a lump in his throat. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That means more than you know. More importantly, Blake and Emma rebuilt their trust. It wasn't easy. Emma challenged him when he slipped into corporate thinking, and he learned to listen. Together, they created a blueprint for hospitality that honored both tradition and innovation. You know what made me fall in love with you? Emma asked one evening as they walked the grounds, snow crunching beneath their feet. Not Benjamin, Nevada, or Blake, Canada, but the man who sat with Mrs. Henderson for hours looking at her. Grandchildren's photos, who helped Chef Marcus perfect his sauce recipe, who saw what made this place special. Blake squeezed her hand, marveling at how right it felt. You helped me find that man again. 1 year later, Blake and Emma stood on the same porch where they'd first met, watching guests arrive for the second annual holiday festival. The resort was thriving, with 5 more properties now operating under their boutique division, each maintaining its unique character while benefiting from their combined expertise. Mrs. Henderson still took her coffee on the east porch, now joined occasionally by Blake's parents, who'd become regular. Guests and unofficial advisors. The Patels celebrated another anniversary, and Chef Marcus's sauce had become famous throughout the region. "Ready for the staff meeting?" Emma asked, straightening Blake's casual sweater. Gone were the designer suits, replaced by clothes more suited to a hands-on resort manager. He smiled, thinking how different his life was from those lonely days in his Manhattan office. "Lead the way, Mrs. Canada." They walked into the resort hand in hand, greeting guests by name, their personal touch setting the tone for everything. Cascade Falls represented a perfect blend of professional excellence and genuine human connection. As they gathered with their staff, Blake caught Emma's eye across the room and saw his own contentment reflected there. He'd climbed to the corporate summit only to find it empty, but here, in this place where authenticity trumped luxury and relationships meant more than revenues, he'd finally found his true peak. "Before we start," Blake said, addressing the assembled staff, "I want to thank all of you. A year ago, I thought I knew everything about this industry. You've all taught me that true hospitality isn't about thread counts or profit margins. It's about making people feel at home, whether they're here for a night or a lifetime." Emma squeezed his hand, pride shining in her eyes. "And we're just getting started," she added. "The Cascade Falls model is spreading. We're showing the world that personal touch and profitability can go hand in hand." As the meeting continued, Blake's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Board meeting went well. They've approved expansion of the boutique division. Looks like your crazy idea's paying off." Blake smiled, putting the phone away. The corporate world was changing, and he was proud to be leading that change. But more than that, he was proud of the life he'd built here, with Emma and the Cascade Falls family. The meeting concluded, and Blake and Emma stepped out onto the porch. The winter sun glinted off the snow-covered landscape, the lake a pristine sheet of ice in the distance. Guests were gathering for the afternoon's activities, ice skating lessons, a winter nature walk, and a gingerbread house workshop, with Chef Marcus. "You know," Emma said, leaning into him, "I never thought I'd be grateful for corporate interference. But if Platinum hadn't set its sights on us—" Blake chuckled, wrapping an arm around her. "Sometimes you have to get lost to find your way home." As they watched their guests and staff mingle, sharing laughter and creating memories, Blake felt a profound sense of peace. He'd found more than a successful business model. He'd rediscovered the heart of hospitality, the joy of creating a place where people truly belonged. And in Emma, he'd found a partner who challenged him, inspired him, and loved him for who he truly was. Not the corporate titan, but the innkeeper's son who'd never really left that Vermont B&B. "Ready for another magical winter?" Emma asked, her eyes sparkling with the same enthusiasm that had first captured his heart. Blake kissed her softly, tasting of cinnamon and promise. "With you. Always." Together, they stepped back into the warmth of Cascade Falls, ready to write the next chapter of their story. One guest, one moment, one genuine connection at a time. What did you think of the story? Leave a comment and a review about this story. If you were moved and enjoyed our work, feel free to help us continue producing. I invite you to click on our link in the first pinned comment. Now, 2 buttons will appear, one to subscribe, if you haven't already, and the other to watch other interesting stories. Choose one. Thank you for watching this far. See you soon.